When I first heard the sound, I honestly thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me because it was early morning and the house still carried that quietness that sits between night and day, the kind that makes every little noise feel louder than it really is. But this sound wasn't just any noise. It was soft at first, like a gentle whimper, almost the sort a newborn makes when it's half awake, half dreaming. And in that moment, I froze in the hallway with my hand still touching the banister because there hadn't been a baby in our home for more than 20 years. Not since my son grew out of his cradle and our room stopped echoing with small cries and warm laughter. And yet here I was, standing in the stillness of dawn, listening to what seemed impossible. At first, I tried to reason with myself because that's what mothers do. We look for logic, even when the heart starts to beat with something we don't understand. I told myself it was probably a bird outside the window or a neighbor's child whose sound carried farther because the air was cold, or maybe even a dream still fading from my mind. But as I moved one step down the wooden stairs, the sound came again, this time clearer, this time unmistakably inside the house, inside our house. And something about it reached straight into a place in my chest I had forgotten existed. I remember whispering, "Hello?" Not because I expected an answer, but because the silence around me felt too heavy, too thick, and my own voice felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. Yet even after I spoke, the cry continued, not louder, not frantic, but steady, like a tiny heartbeat calling out from somewhere behind the walls. For a moment, I stood there, thinking of all the years that had passed, all the memories tucked into corners, all the things my husband and I had packed away when life shifted and children grew up. And I wondered if maybe the past had a way of coming back in sounds we didn't expect. It felt strange to admit it, but the cry didn't scare me as much as it softened me, awakening an ache I didn't even realize I still carried. The ache of being a mother, of once holding something so small and fragile that its entire world fit against my chest. Still, I knew I needed to be sure, even if it meant confronting nothing more than an old house settling or some forgotten device making noise, so I walked slowly toward the living room, each step quieter than the last, my fingers brushing the wall as though the house itself might guide me. The morning light had barely begun to touch the curtains, leaving the room in that pale blue shade that feels both peaceful and unsettling. And for a moment, I felt like I was stepping back in time, into a version of my home I hadn't visited in years. The cry came again, longer this time, and something in me tightened because it didn't feel distant anymore. It felt close. Too close, like it was coming from the far end of the hallway where the storage room sat untouched for nearly a decade. That room, I rarely entered it, mostly because life had piled too many boxes and too many memories in there, but also because some part of me always felt a gentle resistance, as if the room preferred to stay undisturbed. I didn't think much of it until now, when the soft, trembling cry seemed to slip from underneath its door, like a thin ribbon of sound pulling me forward. I paused, just for a breath, because something about standing in front of that closed door made me feel strangely emotional, almost fragile. I remember how it once belonged to my son when he was an infant. The same room where I rocked him through fevered nights, where lullabies floated like tiny prayers, where the wallpaper once had little stars peeling at the edges. Even now, if I closed my eyes, I could still picture the warm glow of the night lamp and the way his small fists opened and closed while he slept. Life changed so quickly after those years. My son growing older, moving into a different room, then eventually moving out entirely as grown children do, and the room slowly filled with old belongings, blankets we never used, books no one read anymore, furniture waiting for new purpose but never quite finding it. And now, for the first time in so long, I felt drawn to it with a sense of tenderness mixed with an unfamiliar unease. because the cry behind that door didn't sound like memory. It sounded real. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but instead of turning it right away, I stood still and whispered to myself, "There's no baby here, remember?" As though saying the truth out loud would somehow untangle the impossible. But the house stayed silent, offering no answer. And in that silence, another cry came, soft, pleading, like the kind a newborn makes when it wants to be held. My heart clenched, not in fear, but in recognition, in the strange, timeless way a mother recognizes a sound meant for her, even if her arms have been empty for many years. I opened the door slowly, letting the faint morning light spill across the cluttered room, illuminating boxes stacked unevenly, old clothes draped over chairs, and dust floating in the air like tiny particles of memory. But there was no crib, no blanket, no child, no explanation at all. Yet somehow the air felt warm, as if someone had just been there. And I stepped inside without thinking, guided only by an instinct that felt older than reason. And then, just as my foot touched the center of the room, the crying stopped completely. Not faded, not muffled, but stopped, as if whatever was making the sound had come to rest the moment I arrived, leaving behind only the soft ringing of silence. I stood still, waiting for something, anything, but the house remained quiet, almost too quiet. And for a brief moment, I wondered if grief and time and motherhood had woven themselves together so tightly inside me that my mind was beginning to replay echoes from a life far behind me. I stepped back, closing the door gently, but as I did, I felt something unexpected. A soft brush of cold air past my wrist, almost like a tiny hand reaching out. I froze, breath catching, and in that still second, something inside me whispered that this was only the beginning, and whatever truth lived in this house was waiting to be heard. I stood there in the hallway, holding my breath, trying to convince myself that the sound I had heard was only the memory of something old inside me, something I had buried long ago but never truly let go of. Yet the quiet house seemed to stretch around me like a long corridor of stillness, watching and waiting for what I would do next. And for a moment, I wished I had the courage to wake my husband or call someone or even whisper a prayer loud enough to steady my shaking hands. But instead, I turned slowly toward the sound, toward the room where it had come from, and each step felt too loud in the silent night, as if the house itself was listening to me move. I reached the door of the guest room, the room no one used anymore, and I paused, touching the old wooden frame that still carried the faint warmth of the afternoon sun from earlier. And as my hand rested there, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a tight pull inside my chest, the kind of ache that comes from remembering something you wish you could forget. And before I could talk myself out of it, before the weight of fear could settle more deeply, I pushed the door open just enough to let the moonlight spill in from the small window on the opposite wall, and the pale light stretched itself across the floor like a thin, uneven blanket, showing me nothing unusual, nothing out of place. The bed was neatly arranged, the folded blanket sat at the foot, the old rocking chair stood still in the corner, unmoving, untouched. Yet the room carried a quiet heaviness that made me step back, as if the air itself had thickened around me. And I whispered into the emptiness, "Is anyone there?" Though I knew no one would answer, because deep inside I believed the sound had come from somewhere no living person could reach. I closed the door gently, not because I feared something would escape, but because I feared I would see more if I looked too long. And when I walked back to my bedroom, the hallway lights flickered softly, just once, but enough for my breath to catch again. Though the electricity often flickered during winter nights, so I told myself it was normal. I told myself everything was normal, even though I could still feel that small, fragile cry echoing in the back of my mind like a fading heartbeat. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dark shape of the wardrobe across the room, trying to steady my thoughts. And when my husband mumbled in his sleep and turned away from me, I wished for a moment that I could wake him, that I could tell him what I heard, that I could ask him if he had ever experienced something like this. But I knew what he would say. He would smile gently, place a hand over mine, and tell me I must be tired and overthinking again, that stress can make the mind play tricks. And I didn't want to hear that because it would make me doubt myself even more. So instead, I wrapped myself around myself, letting the quiet swallow me. And little by little, the night settled again. But the sound, the soft cry, wouldn't leave me even hours later. Even when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, it stayed like a whisper at the edge of my dreams. A whisper that felt too real to ignore. And the next morning, when sunlight filled the house with its warm gold, everything looked so normal, so peaceful.
I questioned every fear I felt the night before, yet when I walked past the guest room on my way to the kitchen, my feet slowed on their own. My hand brushed the same wooden door frame as if drawn by habit, and that strange heaviness returned, quiet but sure. And I stood there for a long moment, wondering if a house could hold on to memories the way people do, if walls could remember sounds that no longer belonged to the present. And just as I began to pull my hand away, something small, something soft, something unmistakable brushed past my thoughts again. The memory of that cry, not loud, not desperate, but gentle, almost familiar. And I froze, realizing that this wasn't the first time I had heard it, that maybe I had been hearing small pieces of it for weeks, maybe months, but it brushed them away as imagination or fatigue because admitting the truth would mean facing a part of my past I wasn't ready to face. I continued to the kitchen, preparing tea with hands that trembled ever so slightly, and as the kettle warmed and the soft sound of boiling water filled the room, I felt a strange mix of fear and longing settle inside me, and I knew, quietly, deeply, that the cry in the night wasn't just a sound, it was a message, a reminder, a call from a time I thought I had buried. And now, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it anymore, because something in the house had woken up, or maybe something inside me had. I grew up believing that every home carried its own quiet music, a soft rhythm made of footsteps, morning routines, doors closing gently, and the comforting sounds of people who loved each other trying their best to get through the day. So when my husband, Samuel, and I moved into this old, slightly crooked, but charming house on the hill, I thought the silence inside it was simply waiting for us to fill it with our own warmth. The house had belonged to an elderly couple who had no children, and when we bought it, their things were already cleared out except for a few forgotten nails in the walls and a lingering scent of lavender that came and went like a memory, unsure of itself. At first, I noticed nothing unusual. I was busy settling in, arranging the kitchen the way I liked, placing our few photographs on the mantels, and opening the old wooden cupboards that creaked like they had existed for far too long. Life felt simple then. Samuel and I were going through a season of quiet rebuilding. We had suffered a loss the year before, something so painful we rarely spoke about it out loud. Our baby, a child we had waited for, prayed for, dreamed about, never made it into this world. That grief had a strange way of following us, not loudly, but like a faint shadow that stayed against the wall no matter how much sunlight we let in. Moving into this house was supposed to be a beginning, a way to breathe again. My mother told me it would help to start fresh somewhere with new walls, new light, and no memories attached. Homes can heal, she had said softly, brushing my hair behind my ear like I was still her little girl. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this house could hold us gently enough to loosen the ache in our hearts. The neighbors were friendly, especially an older woman named Mrs. Crane, who lived across the street and had a habit of watching everything from her porch. She smiled kindly when I waved, but there was always something observant in her eyes, like she knew more about our house than she let on. Once she called out, "If you ever need anything, dear, just knock. Old houses can feel lively sometimes." I laughed politely, though the choice of the word lively stuck with me. Samuel didn't think much of it. He was practical, calm, and always searching for small ways to repair things around the house. He liked being needed by tasks he could fix, maybe because so much of what we had been through recently couldn't be fixed by tools or strong hands. At night, we would often sit together in the living room, sharing tea while the wind brushed against the windows. The quietness of the house felt peaceful then, almost like it was listening to us. Weeks passed gently. I started to enjoy my mornings again, watering the plants in the backyard, cleaning the window frames, and rearranging furniture in a way that made our home feel truly ours. I remember one morning in particular, sunlight pouring through the curtains in soft strips, when I paused and thought, maybe we're finally going to be okay. But then something small happened, something so subtle I told myself it wasn't real. I was folding clothes in the bedroom when I thought I heard a faint sound in the hallway. A soft little sigh, almost like a baby settling in sleep. I froze, holding a shirt against my chest. The house was quiet again, completely still. I waited for several seconds, listening closely, but the sound didn't come back, so I convinced myself it was just my mind remembering things I tried so hard to forget. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I would catch strange moments I couldn't explain. The rocking chair in the corner swaying slightly even when the windows were shut, a small thud in the middle of the night that sounded like something falling but never left anything on the floor, or the soft scent of baby powder drifting past me when I walked through the hallway. I never told Samuel. I didn't want him to worry, and I didn't want him to think I was slipping into memories that would break me again. Instead, I kept quiet, convincing myself it was the house settling or my grief breathing its last bits of air. But deep down, I felt something else, like the house was trying to speak in the smallest possible voice, one easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. One afternoon, while sorting old photo frames we brought from our previous home, I noticed that the tiny bedroom next to ours always stayed a little colder than the rest of the house. Not freezing, not uncomfortable, just gently cold, like a room that had been asleep for a long time. When I stepped inside, the floor creaked under my weight in a way that echoed deeper than any other spot. The room had white walls, simple and plain, and for the longest time I tried not to think of what it could have become if life had gone differently for us. I closed the door quickly. I didn't want to linger there. As the days passed, the feeling grew, not frightening, not overwhelming, but unsettling in a quiet way. It was like the house held a memory of its own, something tucked into its corners, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. Still, I pushed all of it to the back of my mind. I focused on routines, on cooking dinner, on listening to Samuel talk about his day, on pretending that little strange things didn't follow me from room to room. But late at night, when the house grew still and the shadows stretched across the ceiling, I felt it again. That faint, soft sound I couldn't name. And every time I heard it, something inside me whispered, "You know exactly what that sounds like." But I wasn't ready to believe it, not yet.
I remember the days after that first strange night feeling heavier than usual, as if a quiet fog had settled over our house, gently wrapping itself around every corner and hallway, making each room feel both familiar and slightly distant. I tried to convince myself that stress was the reason I kept hearing the faint echoes of that soft cry, even when the house seemed peaceful on the outside. My husband, Daniel, noticed I had grown quieter than usual, and he would often ask, "Are you sleeping enough?" in that gentle voice of his, the one that always made me feel safe even when my thoughts were tangled. I would nod, pretending everything was fine, but the truth was that sleep had become something I avoided because nighttime had started feeling like a long corridor I didn't want to walk through. During the day, I tried to surround myself with normal routine, making tea, watering the small plants that lined my kitchen window, folding clothes even when they didn't need folding, simple things that gave my hands something to do even if my mind stayed restless. My mother, who lived only a few streets away, visited often, and she would place her warm hand on mine and say softly, "You look tired, sweetheart," and I would smile the way daughters smile when they don't want their mothers to worry. I didn't know how to tell her about the sound of that baby crying because I feared the look that might appear in her eyes, the look she had worn years ago when I lost my own baby long before I ever had the chance to hold them. I didn't want to reopen that old grief, the one we had packed away quietly, piece by piece, like someone closing a box they prayed would never need opening again. So instead, I changed the subject whenever she came close to it, offering her tea or asking about her garden, or telling her about a recipe I had tried. Still, there were moments when her gaze lingered on me a little longer than I liked, as if she could sense the storm moving inside me. Daniel, too, grew more attentive. Even though I avoided telling him the whole truth, he could sense something shifting in the house, even if he couldn't name it. Sometimes he would pause in the hallway and look around with a puzzled expression, as if trying to catch a sound that slipped away just before he could understand it. I noticed how he started sleeping closer to me, almost protectively, his hand reaching for mine in the middle of the night without even waking up. It made my heart ache in a tender way. I wanted to be honest with him, but the words never came because I feared he might think grief was finally catching up with me again after all those years. And maybe it was. I didn't know. Some evenings when I sat alone in the living room reading a book I could no longer follow, I would hear faint footsteps upstairs, soft and slow, as if someone very small was walking carefully down the hallway. Every time I gathered the courage to look, I found nothing, just empty space, a quiet stillness, and the familiar way the shadows lengthened against the walls. I tried telling myself it was the house settling, just wood and old pipes making their usual music, but deep down, I knew these sounds were different. They felt intentional, almost delicate, like they belonged to someone who didn't want to scam me. The strange thing was that nothing else changed in the house. No objects moved, no doors opened on their own, no lights flickered. It was only the soft crying and the gentle footsteps, almost polite in the way they appeared and disappeared. Life on the outside continued normally. Daniel went to work every morning, humming as he tied his shoes. My mother brought fresh bread every Thursday. I visited my neighbor Leah for tea on Sunday afternoons, and she talked about her grandchildren with the joy only a grandmother could hold in her voice. I nodded and smiled, pretending I was fully present, though my thoughts kept drifting back home to that quiet sound waiting for me somewhere inside the walls. Nights became a mix of courage and fear. Courage because I managed to fall asleep, fear because I didn't know what I might hear when the house fell silent. Sometimes the crying was closer, faint but clear, like someone calling softly from another room. Sometimes it was distant, almost like a memory trying to find its way home. And each time I felt my heart tighten in a way I couldn't fully explain. I didn't feel threatened. Strangely, I felt drawn to it, as if something inside me recognized that sound even though it didn't make sense. As the days passed, I found myself lingering near the old guest room upstairs, a room we rarely used except to store things we didn't need anymore.
Ever since I lost my baby years ago, I avoided decorating it or turning it into something meaningful. It simply became a room with closed curtains, untouched boxes, and a quiet that made me uneasy in a way I never fully understood. And yet, that was the room I found myself standing outside more often now, my hand hovering near the doorknob, feeling a soft chill brush against my skin whenever I got too close. I didn't open it. Not yet. Something inside me wasn't ready, though I couldn't explain why. I just knew that whatever was happening in this house was connected to something deeper, something old, maybe even something tender that had been resting in silence for too long. And even though I tried to ignore it, a part of me whispered that the house wasn't trying to frighten me, it was trying to tell me something. Or someone was. And slowly, gently, I felt myself beginning to listen.
I remember the day the tension in our home shifted, not in any loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet, unsettling way that makes a person look over their shoulder without knowing why. And it began one cold evening when I was folding laundry in the living room, and heard that faint, trembling cry again, the same soft baby sound that had followed me for days, always close but never close enough to be found. And this time I didn't freeze. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where the cry seemed to echo, my heart gently hammering against my ribs like it wasn't afraid, just confused, as if it was trying to remember something it had once known. The sound drifted toward the old storage room, the little room next to the kitchen that we barely used anymore. And for the first time in years, I reached for its doorknob, only to stop when the crying abruptly cut off. Not fading, not softening, just stopping so cleanly that the silence felt heavier than the noise. And I let out a shaky breath because part of me wondered if grief could shape itself into sound when left alone too long. I didn't tell my daughter, Eliza, about the crying that night because she was already overwhelmed from balancing work, motherhood, and caring for this house since her husband traveled so often. And she sat at the kitchen table with her face buried in her hands, whispering that she felt tired in ways she didn't even understand. So I simply made her a cup of warm tea and sat beside her in silence, wanting to comfort her without adding another worry. But even as we sat there, the quiet between us was not peaceful. It was thick, as if the walls themselves were listening. And I felt that strange shift again, that tiny pressure inside the house that didn't belong. Over the next few days, little things began happening that were easy to explain individually, but harder to ignore as a pattern. A door that had been shut would be slightly open the next morning. A small blanket from the attic I never touched ended up folded on the couch. And once, when I walked past the guest room, I swore I smelled baby powder, that soft, clean scent I hadn't encountered in years. And I stood there with my hand on my chest, wondering if memory itself had a scent and was playing tricks on me. Still, I kept everything inside, believing that if I stayed calm, everything would sort itself out. But the house didn't seem to want calm. It kept pushing back in quiet ways, and the tension slowly seeped into our everyday life. I found myself waking at night, not from noise, but from a feeling, like someone was standing beside the bed, watching me with an emotion I couldn't name, not anger and not sadness. Something softer but heavier too. And each time I turned on the lamp, the room sat there in stillness, pretending it hadn't been breathing a moment ago. One afternoon, as I was washing dishes, I heard a small thud behind me, not loud, just the gentle sound of something small falling. And when I turned, I saw a tiny knitted baby sock lying on the kitchen floor, one I knew for certain hadn't been in the house in years. And when I picked it up, my fingers tingled as if touching something that didn't belong to this time. The moment Eliza walked in, however, I shoved it into my pocket, because she already looked pale and worn, rubbing her temples like the world was sitting on her shoulders, and I didn't want to add anything to that weight. That night at dinner, her little boy, my grandson, pushed his food around without eating, and finally whispered, "Grandma, there's someone crying in the walls." And the spoon slipped from my hand as he looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, not scared, just confused, the way children are when they believe adults already know everything. And I forced a gentle smile and said maybe he was dreaming, but inside my stomach tightened because this meant it wasn't only me, it wasn't only grief or imagination or memory. Something was happening, something small, something quiet, something steady. Over the coming days, the crying sound came more often, always at times when the house felt still, early mornings or late evenings when the world softened and the mind wandered, and I began to notice that it grew stronger when I stood near that old storage room, the one we barely entered anymore. And I would place my hand on the doorknob, but never turn it, feeling an odd mixture of fear and tenderness, like something on the other side didn't want to hurt me, but wasn't ready to be revealed either. And slowly the atmosphere in the house changed, not in frightening ways, but in emotional ones. Like a presence full of longing was moving through the rooms, touching little things, leaving traces of comfort and sadness at the same time. And sometimes, when I sat in the living room knitting, I felt the faintest impression beside me on the couch as if someone very light had just sat down. And though my body tensed, my heart softened unexpectedly because instead of fear, what spread through me was a strange motherly ache, the kind that comes only when something small and helpless needs you. But the tension grew too, quietly weaving itself between me and Eliza, until even simple conversations felt heavier. She grew more irritable, more anxious, snapping at small things, apologizing immediately after, saying the house made her feel watched, and at night I heard her walking from room to room as if checking that the world was still intact. One evening she finally said in a trembling voice, "Mom, something feels wrong here," and even though my heart wanted to spill everything, the crying, the blanket, the sock, the feeling of being accompanied, I simply reached across the table and took her hand, telling her we were fine,
Telling her home sometimes held memories the way people held breath. Telling her nothing was wrong even though the words felt unsteady in my mouth. And yet the baby cry came again that night, louder than before, echoing from the hallway with a tremble full of need. And this time I didn't walk toward it. I stood perfectly still and let tears gather in my eyes, because something inside me finally admitted what I hadn't dared to think. The sound wasn't here to harm us. It was here because something unfinished, something deeply emotional, was woven into these walls. And whatever it was only growing stronger.
I kept telling myself that everything I was hearing, those faint cries that drifted through the hallway, those soft hiccups that rose and faded like a tide, those almost whispers that felt shaped like a baby's breath, were only in my imagination. But the days that followed made it impossible to live inside that denial for long. Every morning I would wake up with that familiar heaviness in my chest, unsure if it was worry, fear, or some strange mixture of memories that had been stirred awake by the sound of that cry. Because the truth was, I had known a baby's cry before, and a part of me had buried that memory so deeply that hearing even the echo of such a sound felt like someone gently lifting the lid off a box I had never wanted opened. It didn't help that the house itself seemed quieter during that week, as if every corner, every picture frame, every breath waited to see if I would hear the sound again. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, cooking a few small meals, or stepping outside to water the plants. But every time my hands began to move, my mind returned to the hallway outside the spare bedroom, the place where the sound had first touched me. And each night around the same time, just after the lights dimmed and the house settled into that soft, tired silence, the little cry returned, floating through the air like it belonged somewhere, like it came from someone. I didn't tell my husband yet, partly because I didn't want him to worry, and partly because I wasn't ready to say the words out loud, afraid that speaking them might make them too real. But I did begin watching him more closely. He would sit in the living room reading the newspaper or checking his phone, making small comments about the day, the weather, the small things old married couples talk about when life is gentle. And I kept wondering if the sound would reach him too, if his head would slightly tilt or his eyebrows would rise the way mine had. But nothing happened. He didn't flinch, he didn't pause. He didn't seem to hear anything at all. That only made the question heavier. Why me? The turning point came one late afternoon when I was sorting through some old boxes in the storage room, looking for a cookbook I thought I had misplaced years ago. As I shifted things around, dust floating through the dim light, I found an old baby blanket folded neatly inside one of the boxes. Soft, small, and pale yellow, with tiny embroidered stars along the edges. The moment I touched it, a wave of warmth and ache rolled through me. Something like a memory but softer, almost like a feeling I had avoided touching for decades. And then there it was, the sound again. A faint whimper, close. So close it felt like it came from behind me. I froze, the blanket still in my hands, and held my breath. But just as quickly as it came, it drifted away again, dissolving into the air like smoke. For the first time, instead of fear, I felt something else, something closer to confusion or longing, or the quiet ache of something unfinished. That night, I finally told my husband. I didn't sit down or prepare a careful explanation. I simply stood in the kitchen doorway while he was washing his hands and said, "Have you heard it? The crying?" He looked at me with a slow confusion, then gentle concern, and said, "Crying? What kind of crying?" I swallowed hard. A baby crying in the house. He dried his hands calmly, the way he always did when he wanted to choose his words carefully, and said, "No, I haven't heard anything like that. Maybe it's from outside. You know how sound travels." But the way he said it, soft, steady, carried a quiet worry, the kind that tries not to show itself. For a moment, we stood there in silence, both of us listening, but the house remained painfully quiet, almost as if it was waiting for the right moment. I told him about the baby blanket, about how familiar it felt when I touched it, and I could see something shift in his expression, like a small shadow moving behind his eyes. He didn't say much, but he nodded slowly and said, "Maybe we should go through the whole storage room together. Maybe there's something we forgot." His words lingered with me because the truth was, there was something we had forgotten, something we had never spoken about for years, something that lived quietly in the corners of our lives like dust behind a cabinet, the child we almost had. I went to bed that night with a mind full of memories, some of them sharp, some of them blurred by time, and as I lay there in the dark, I heard the house creak softly before the cry returned.
This time, slower, longer, and undistinctably inside the house. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the hallway again, but softer, like the child, whoever it was tired. I quietly slipped out of bed, afraid of waking my husband, and stepped into the hallway with careful feet. The sound sounded almost right beside me, but when I looked around, expecting movement, expecting something, there was nothing but the still air and the faint smell of old wood. I whispered into the dark, "It's okay. I'm here." Not sure why I said it or who I was saying it to, but the moment I spoke, the crying stopped, as if someone had pressed a finger gently against it. The silence that followed felt different, not heavy, not frightening, just deeply sad, almost peaceful. The next morning, I found something new. Near the door of the spare bedroom, there was a small mark on the floor, almost like a scuff from someone sitting there or perhaps resting something on the wood. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the feeling that something unseen was trying to lead me somewhere grew stronger. That evening, when my husband was sitting in the living room, I walked toward the spare bedroom door with a kind of quiet determination, almost as if something inside me finally wanted to uncover what I had been avoiding for years. When I reached out and touched the doorknob, a soft chill ran through my hand. Not cold exactly, but familiar, the way a memory feels when it brushes lightly against your heart. I paused, wondering if I should turn the knob or step back, but before I could decide, I heard it. The sound that everything in the house seemed to revolve around now, the soft cry of a baby coming from inside the room we had not opened in years. But this time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was clear, echoing, almost like the baby was just on the other side of the door waiting for me to respond. And as I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, my breath caught in my throat as I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Maybe the sound wasn't here to frighten me. Maybe it was here to remind me.
As the days turned into weeks, the cries grew more distinct, sharper, and somehow more insistent, piercing the quiet corners of the house in a way that made my chest tighten and my thoughts race, and I found myself pacing the hallways in the dead of night, trying to convince my mind that it was only imagination, that the sound of the wind, the creak of the old floorboards, or the hum of the pipes could explain the mystery, but every time I closed my eyes or turned a corner, the cries returned with a clarity that could not be ignored, drawing me toward rooms where nothing by all accounts should exist, and in that relentless pursuit of answers, I began noticing small signs I had overlooked before. A faint scent of powder lingering in the air, the soft indent of tiny footprints in dusted corners that I was sure had been swept only hours earlier, and the faint warmth on a chair that was meant to be empty, as if someone or something had been there moments before, leaving an invisible presence behind, pressing me to confront a reality that felt stranger than any story I had ever heard. And I realized that the line between memory, imagination, and something beyond explanation was blurring, that the house itself seemed to breathe with a hidden rhythm, and that perhaps the walls held secrets that even I had never been prepared to uncover. And one evening, as the sunset painted the living room in orange shadows, I heard the cries again, this time accompanied by a whisper so soft I almost thought I imagined it, a voice that seemed familiar yet unreachable, calling a single word, my name, in a tone that was at once urgent and sorrowful, and I froze, my hand resting on the doorknob to the hallway that led to the sound, feeling a chill run through my spine and a rush of memories I had buried for years. The night my cousin vanished, the lullabies my grandmother once sang, the empty crib my mother always kept in the corner just in case, all converging in a haunting symphony that demanded attention. And as I stepped cautiously toward the source, I noticed the faint shimmer of movement behind the living room curtains, a shadow that didn't belong to any person I knew, shifting as if trying to hide or perhaps to beckon me closer. And in that moment, the floorboards beneath my feet creaked differently, more deliberately, as if signaling the arrival of something I had long ignored. And I remembered the stories my mother told me as a child about the spirits of infants who lingered when life had been cut short, stories I had laughed at her dismissed as folklore, yet the sound before me carried a weight that seemed to transcend myth, a presence that demanded recognition, empathy, and courage. And I felt the fear and wonder collide in my chest, a tight knot of tension and anticipation that left me breathless, unable to decide whether to flee or embrace the unknown. And I knew that whatever lay ahead, the truth could not be avoided, that the cries were a message, a plea, a revelation, and that the ordinary walls of my home were suddenly transformed into a stage where past, present, and mystery converged in a way that I could neither fully comprehend nor deny. And as I reached the hallway leading to the nursery that had never held a baby, my hand trembled on the light switch to the nursery that had never held a baby, my hand trembled on the light switch to the hallway, and I hesitated, heart pounding, realizing that the moment of revelation was upon me, that the boundary between what I believed and what truly existed was dissolving, and I understood with an almost sacred clarity that stepping forward was both a choice and a necessity, that fear could not be the barrier, and that I must confront whatever had been hidden in silence for so long, because the story of the cries, the whispers, and the unseen presence demanded not only my attention but my empathy, my courage, and my willingness to see beyond the familiar, to embrace the strange, the tender, and the enduring truths woven into the fabric of my family home, and with a deep breath steadying myself against the quiver in my chest, I pushed open the door to the room where no baby had ever lived, only to find that the space was transformed, as if memory and presence had merged, the air heavy with both absence and lingering life, and I realized that the turning point was not just the moment of discovery, but the awakening of my awareness, the recognition that love, loss, and mystery often coexist in ways that are subtle, profound, and inescapable. And as I stepped fully into the room, the cries softened, almost as if welcoming me, guiding me to understand that what I was experiencing was not a haunting meant to terrify, but a message meant to teach, to connect, and to remind me that the threads of family, memory, and compassion stretch far beyond what we can see, hear, or logically explain. And in that realization, I felt a mixture of sorrow, awe, and reverence, knowing that the night I had feared would bring only terror, instead brought revelation, a bridge between the living and the echoes of what had been, and I understood that the journey through fear had led me to empathy, insight, and a deeper connection to the intangible, the unseen, and the enduring spirit of those who touch our lives in ways that are invisible yet undeniably present. And the turning point had arrived, not with a loud announcement or dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet unveiling of truth that demanded attention, reflection, and a heart open enough to receive it. And in that silent, charged space, I realized that the cries were not meant to frighten, but to awaken, not to confuse, but to illuminate. And I knew that from this point forward, everything in the house, in my memory, and in my understanding of family and presence would be seen differently, forever colored by the moment when fear, curiosity, and love intersected in the most unexpected and transformative way.
The air in the room seemed to thrum with a presence I could not see but could feel with every nerve in my body, a subtle vibration that made the hair on my arms stand on end and my heart race in a rhythm that matched the soft, intermittent cries that now sounded almost like whispers, urging me forward and yet warning me to tread carefully. And as I moved closer to the corner where the sound seemed strongest, I noticed an old rocking chair swaying ever so slightly, as though someone or something had just left it, and the room, though empty of any living child, carried an unmistakable warmth, a weight of life once held there, lingering like a gentle echo that refused to fade. And I realized that this was no ordinary haunting, no simple trick of the imagination. This was a moment where the boundaries between what had been, what was, and what might be were blurred, forcing me to confront questions I had never asked, feelings I had long ignored, and truths that had been silently waiting for decades to reveal themselves. And I thought of the nights I had spent hearing the cries without understanding, of the corners of the house that I had avoided because of unease, and I suddenly understood that the turning point had not arrived by chance. It had been building for years, through small signs, forgotten objects, whispered warnings, and subtle, persistent disturbances that now converged into a single, undeniable reality. And as I looked around, I saw objects that belonged to no one I knew. A small blanket draped over the back of a chair, a toy rattle resting on the windowsill, and photographs of children I had never met. Yet their faces bore a resemblance that stirred a deep, inexplicable recognition within me. And I felt tears prick my eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming awareness that this room was a vessel of untold stories, of lives touched and altered by love, loss, and absence. And as the cries softened into a rhythmic, almost comforting cadence, I realized that they were guiding me toward understanding, encouraging me to piece together the fragments of memory, history, and mystery that had been left for me to find. And I began speaking softly, almost instinctively, to the room itself, to the presence I could not see, words of reassurance, apology, and connection spilling from my lips as though the act of acknowledging this space, its history, and its significance could somehow bridge the divide between absence and presence, past and present, life and memory. And in that dialogue, however one-sided it seemed, I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the room exhaled a long-held breath, allowing me to sense the depth of feeling it carried. And in that instant, I knew that the cries were not random or cruel. They were a message, a story waiting to be heard, and I understood that my role was not to solve a mystery in the traditional sense, but to bear witness, to honor the lives and emotions contained within these walls. And as I approached the center of the room, I saw a small wooden cradle, empty yet vibrating with a presence that felt tangible, almost like a heartbeat. And I knelt beside it, placing my hand on the worn wood, feeling a warmth that defied explanation. And I whispered, "I see you. I hear you. I understand." And in that quiet, reverent moment, the cry slowed, softening into gentle coos and sighs, like the room was acknowledging that it had been understood at last, that the silence that had held for decades was finally being met with empathy, recognition, and care.
And I felt an incredible mixture of relief, sorrow, and awe, understanding that the turning point was not just about discovering a hidden truth, but about stepping into a space of compassion, courage, and deep emotional connection, recognizing the lives, the absences, and the love that had shaped this house and our family in ways both visible and unseen. And as I stayed there, letting the room's energy settle around me, I noticed a small chest tucked against the wall, covered in dust. And when I lifted the lid, I found letters, journals, and photographs carefully preserved, items that had remained untouched for years. And reading them slowly, tenderly, I realized that these documents revealed the story of a child who had lived briefly in our home, whose presence had been quietly honored, hidden, and mourned in ways I had never known. And I understood that my family's history was far richer and more complicated than I had imagined, that the ordinary routines of daily life had been intertwined with extraordinary love, grief, and memory, and that acknowledging this truth required both humility and reverence, a willingness to see beyond the surface, to feel deeply, and to carry forward the lessons embedded in these hidden lives. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of closure, not in the dramatic sense, but in the deeply emotional, transformative way that comes from truly witnessing, understanding, and accepting the echoes of the past. And I knew that the cries, the shadows, and the whispers had all been leading me to this point, that the turning point had been reached not through confrontation or fear, but through presence, empathy, and the courage to embrace the unknown. And as I carefully returned each letter and photograph to the chest, I felt a gentle peace settle over the room, a sense that the story had been acknowledged and that the space, once filled with mystery and longing, had finally found recognition. And in that moment, I understood that the power of family, memory, and love does not always reside in words, but in quiet acknowledgement, patience, and the willingness to witness what has been hidden. And I left the room that night with a heart full of gratitude, awareness, and a deep, unshakable respect for the invisible threads that connect us all, knowing that the turning point had revealed not only the secrets of a room or a child who once lived within these walls, but the enduring strength of empathy, the quiet courage required to face the unknown, and the profound impact of bearing witness to what is unseen yet deeply felt. And I realized that this moment would forever change the way I approached my family, my home, and the unseen stories that linger quietly in the spaces we inhabit, reminding me that sometimes the most extraordinary revelations come not in loud declarations, but in the softest whispers, in the tender presence of a life once lived, and in the courage to truly see, hear, and honor it.
In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath, and I realized that the moment of confrontation with the unknown had given way to something far gentler, a space for understanding, reflection, and healing that I hadn't anticipated but welcomed with a sense of reverence. And as I walked slowly through the familiar hallways, I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. The subtle play of sunlight across the old wooden floors, the faint smell of lavender lingering in the corners, the way the photographs on the walls captured not just faces but emotions, moments, and connections that span generations. And I understood that the cries, the shadows, and the whispers had not been a haunting meant to frighten, but a reminder of the depth, fragility, and beauty of life, of the love and loss that threads through our families quietly, persistently, sometimes unnoticed until a moment like this awakens our awareness. And I reflected on the letters, journals, and photographs I had discovered in the hidden chest, realizing that the story they told was not just about a child who had briefly existed in our home, but about the invisible, enduring ways in which people leave traces of themselves, the small gestures, memories, and touches that shape those who remain. And I felt a wave of gratitude and sorrow, recognizing that while life moves forward, it carries with it echoes of the past that deserve acknowledgement, and that healing comes not from erasing grief, but from understanding it, giving it space, and embracing the lessons it offers. And as I returned to the room one last time, placing the letters carefully back into the chest and closing it with a gentle, deliberate motion, I sensed a profound calm, a reassurance that the room's story had been witnessed, that the life it had held had been honored, and that in some way the cries I had heard were now at peace, having found a listener, a guardian, and a heart willing to carry the memory forward. And I thought about my family, about the moments we often overlook, the words we fail to speak, the attention we neglect to give to the spaces and people that matter most. And I realized that the room, the cries, and the hidden artifacts had not just revealed a secret. They had taught me a lesson about presence, empathy, and the power of observation, about noticing the small, persistent signs in our homes, our relationships, and our own hearts that tell us what needs attention, care, and acknowledgement. And I remembered the nights of fear and curiosity, the pacing through empty hallways, the almost unbearable tension of listening for a sound that seemed impossible. And I understood that the courage it took to face the unknown had brought me to this point of understanding. And that courage, when coupled with patience and empathy, could transform even the most unsettling mysteries into lessons of love, connection, and respect. And I thought about the child whose presence had lingered so quietly, whose story had gone unnoticed for so long. And I felt a mix of sadness for what was lost, awe at the enduring traces of life, and a renewed sense of responsibility to honor those who come before us, whose lives, however brief or hidden, shape the ones that follow. And as I shared this discovery with my family over the following days, explaining the chest, the letters, and the small, subtle signs that had guided me, I noticed a shift in all of us, a softness, a willingness to reflect, to speak, and to embrace the stories that often remain unspoken. And in these conversations, tears were shed, laughter returned, and connections deepened. And I realized that the resolution was not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual unfolding of understanding, a collective acknowledgement of love, loss, and memory. And I felt an immense sense of gratitude for having the courage to face the unknown, to listen, and to honor what had been hidden. And I understood that the cries, once a source of fear and confusion, had led to healing, closure, and a stronger bond within our family, teaching us that sometimes the most profound truths arrive quietly, insistently, and that paying attention to them can transform fear into empathy, confusion into clarity, and absence into connection. And as I looked around the house, now imbued with the quiet energy of acknowledgement, I felt a renewed sense of home, of belonging, and of the enduring magic that resides not just in the people we see, but in the stories we uncover, the memories we preserve, and the love we choose to honor. And I knew that this resolution, gentle yet profound, had changed not only the house, but also the way I would approach life, relationships, and the quiet, mysterious ways that family, memory, and presence shape us all, leaving me with a heart full of understanding, a mind open to mystery, and a soul deeply connected to the invisible threads of life that carry both sorrow and joy, teaching me that even the smallest, most hidden spaces in our homes and hearts can hold lessons of immeasurable significance, if only we have the courage to notice, to listen, and to care.
After those first days of discovery, the house began to feel different, lighter somehow, as if the acknowledgement of the room's hidden past had lifted an invisible weight. And I noticed that even ordinary moments, the sound of the wind through the trees, the creak of the floorboards, the distant laughter of neighbors, seemed richer, more layered, carrying with them the awareness of history, presence, and memory that had always existed just beneath the surface. And as I shared more of the story with my family, we began to explore the home together, not in fear or curiosity alone, but with care, reverence, and the intention to understand, noticing the corners, the drawers, and the shelves that had once seemed mundane, but now held a quiet significance. And through this shared exploration, I felt the bonds within our family strengthen, the softening of unspoken tensions, and the gentle opening of conversations that had long been avoided about grief, memory, and the invisible ways in which past events influence our present. And I realized that the room had not just been a vessel for a hidden life, but a catalyst for deeper connection, awareness, and understanding, reminding us that every home, every family, and every life carries unseen stories waiting to be acknowledged. And as I revisited the small chest, I discovered more letters and photographs, each one a piece of a puzzle that revealed a narrative of love, loss, and resilience. And with each discovery,
I felt a growing respect for the courage and tenderness of those who had lived before me, whose lives had left echoes that shaped my own experiences. And I began to share these stories with my children in gentle, age-appropriate ways, teaching them not just about events that had occurred decades ago, but about empathy, attention, and the importance of honoring memories, both seen and unseen. And in this act of sharing, I felt a profound healing, as if the room's long-held secrets were finally being met with acknowledgement, understanding, and love. And I understood that resolution is rarely abrupt or dramatic. It arrives slowly, through reflection, connection, and the willingness to engage with the past with compassion. And as the days turned into weeks, the cries that had haunted me faded into memory, replaced by a calm, quiet presence, a sense of continuity and wholeness that came from the act of truly listening and witnessing. And I noticed that even the smallest objects, the rocking chair, the blanket, the rattle, had acquired new meaning, becoming symbols of acknowledgement, remembrance, and care. And in observing them, I felt a deep gratitude for the lessons they carried about presence, patience, and the courage to face what is hidden. And I realized that our family too had grown, evolving in response to this understanding, developing a shared language of care, observation, and respect for the unseen influences in our lives. And in moments of quiet reflection, I would often sit in the room, alone or with a family member, and simply breathe, letting the energy of the space settle around me, feeling connected not just to the child who had lived there long ago, but to every generation that had come before and every life that would follow. And I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that our role as witnesses, caretakers, and storytellers was ongoing, that we carry the responsibility to honor the hidden, the overlooked, and the untold, and that in doing so, we not only preserve history, but also cultivate empathy, awareness, and love within ourselves and our family. And I began documenting these experiences, writing down the details, the discoveries, and the lessons learned so that future generations could understand, reflect, and continue the practice of noticing and caring. And I realized that this resolution was more than the uncovering of a secret. It was an awakening to the ways in which attention, empathy, and presence shape life, relationships, and memory, teaching us that even the most ordinary spaces can hold extraordinary truths if only we approach them with open hearts, curiosity, and respect. And as I watched my family interact, sharing stories, laughing softly, and pausing to reflect on the past, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the room, the cries, and the hidden artifacts had fulfilled their purpose, guiding us toward understanding, connection, and closure. And in that quiet satisfaction, I knew that the lessons of the room would stay with us, quietly influencing our choices, our empathy, and our awareness in ways both subtle and profound, reminding us that the unseen, the unheard, and the forgotten are often the most powerful teachers, and that honoring them requires patience, attentiveness, and a willingness to face emotions that are sometimes uncomfortable but ultimately transformative. And in this space, I understood the true meaning of resolution, not the end of mystery, but the embracing of truth, the deep listening, and the gentle acknowledgement of life in all its complexity. And I felt a soft, enduring gratitude for the guidance this hidden room had offered, for the courage it had demanded, and for the quiet, powerful presence it had instilled in our family, a reminder that love, memory, and empathy are the threads that connect generations, and that even in absence, those we have lost, the stories we have forgotten, and the mysteries we uncover can teach us about resilience, understanding, and the extraordinary depth of ordinary life.
As the days settled into a gentle rhythm, I found myself pausing more often, noticing the small details in our home and family that had once gone unnoticed. The way sunlight streamed through the curtains in the morning, the quiet hum of the refrigerator at night, the subtle scent of flowers from the garden drifting through the hallways. And I realized that life itself is built from these small, often overlooked moments that hold meaning if we choose to pay attention. And the room, once a source of mystery and tension, had become a quiet teacher, reminding me to observe, to listen, and to honor the unseen. And as I sat with my children, sharing stories of our past, of the room and its hidden life, I saw curiosity in their eyes, a desire to understand. And I understood that by speaking of these things, I was giving them not just knowledge of events, but lessons in empathy, patience, and the importance of noticing the subtle truths that surround us every day. And the walls of our home seemed warmer now, holding the echoes of laughter, whispers, and memories that had once been trapped. And I felt a sense of continuity, as if the room had stitched together past and present, giving us a bridge to understand not only our family's history, but the depth of our shared humanity. And I often returned to the chest, gently lifting the letters, photographs, and small objects, letting my fingers linger over them, feeling the weight of life they represented. And I spoke softly to my family about the lessons I had learned, the importance of attention, of listening without judgment, and of embracing both joy and sorrow with equal care. And in these conversations, I noticed a quiet transformation, not just in myself, but in my children and spouse, a growing awareness that even what is hidden or forgotten deserves acknowledgement, and that every memory, every life, even if briefly lived or unseen, leaves a mark that shapes those who follow. And the quiet energy of understanding spread through our home, infusing ordinary days with a sense of presence, reflection, and respect for the stories carried in each room, each corner, and each heart. And I realized that the room's mystery had gifted us more than answers. It had given us patience, empathy, and a deeper appreciation for the fragility and beauty of life. And in the evenings, when the house was still, I would sometimes hear the faint echoes of the past, the soft cries, the whispers, or the rustle of unseen footsteps. And instead of fear, I felt comfort, knowing that these traces of life were now honored, witnessed, and remembered, and that through acknowledgement, understanding, and presence, we could transform fear into love, mystery into lesson, and absence into connection. And I thought often about how easy it is to overlook the stories that exist quietly around us in homes, families, and hearts. And I understood that the courage to face the unknown, to listen, and to care is what allows these stories to be recognized and their lessons to be passed forward. And in these reflections, I felt a deep gratitude for the journey, for the discovery, and for the quiet transformation it had brought to our family, teaching us that resolution is not a moment, but a process, a gentle unfolding of awareness, compassion, and love, and that sometimes the most profound changes occur not in dramatic events, but in the soft, persistent acknowledgement of life as it is, in all its complexity, beauty, and mystery. And I felt a renewed sense of responsibility to carry these lessons into the future, to speak of what is hidden, to honor those who have passed, and to recognize the subtle ways in which love, memory, and presence shape our lives. And as I watched my children play, laugh, and ask questions about the stories I shared, I knew that the lessons of the room, the child, and the hidden life would live on, gently influencing the way we notice, care, and connect. And I felt a quiet peace, a deep satisfaction in the awareness that even the most ordinary spaces in our home held extraordinary significance if we were willing to look, listen, and understand, and that this practice of noticing, honoring, and sharing was the true inheritance we could leave for our family, a gift of empathy, awareness, and love that would ripple through generations. And I knew that in embracing these moments, stories, and memories, we create a home not just of walls and rooms, but of understanding, warmth, and quiet magic, where the unseen is acknowledged, the unheard is heard, and the forgotten is remembered. And in that realization, I felt a soft, enduring joy, a gentle hope, and a profound connection to the past, present, and future of our family. Knowing that through care, attention, and love, even the most mysteries of life can become lessons of heart, soul, and enduring family ties.
As the weeks passed, I noticed a quiet shift in our home, a softness that hadn't been there before, the kind that comes from understanding, from bearing witness to life's hidden moments and accepting them with gentle hearts. And our family began to embrace not just the room and its secrets, but the lessons it carried, teaching us patience, empathy, and the importance of noticing what is often overlooked. And I would sometimes sit by the doorway of the room, feeling the weight of decades of silence slowly lift, sensing the presence of the life that had once filled it and the echoes of every emotion it had held. And I spoke to my children about these things, explaining that life is made of seen and unseen moments, that the memories we carry and those we discover shape who we are, and that listening, truly listening, is one of the greatest acts of love. And as they grew curious, asking questions about the cries, the letters, the objects, I answered gently, never forcing understanding, but letting them feel the story, experience the care, and witness the compassion it inspired. And through this sharing, I realized that the room, once a source of fear and mystery, had become a center for growth, reflection, and connection, not just for me, but for every member of our family, teaching us that the invisible threads of life, though hidden, bind us in ways we may not always understand, and that by acknowledging them, we honor both the past and the present. And I began writing down these experiences, recording the details, the lessons, and the quiet moments of awareness, not to preserve drama, but to capture the essence of what it means to witness, to care, and to pass on understanding. And in doing so, I felt the circle of life expand, encompassing both the unseen child and the living family, bridging gaps of time, memory, and emotion. And I saw how small gestures, a soft word, a careful observation, a moment of patience could ripple through our home, transforming ordinary days into times of reflection and subtle growth. And the objects in the room, once merely remnants of a hidden life, became symbols of endurance, remembrance, and love, teaching us to honor not only what we see, but what exists quietly alongside us, shaping our hearts and choices. And I realized that the true value of the room was not in the secrets it held, but in the transformation it inspired, in the way our family began to listen, notice, and care for one another more deeply. And as I watched my children interact with each other and with me, I saw empathy growing, curiosity mingling with respect, and a recognition that every life, every story, seen or unseen, holds lessons worth honoring. And in these moments, I understood that closure is not simply about solving a mystery or finding answers, but about embracing awareness, presence, and connection, about letting love and understanding guide our actions and our hearts. And I felt a calm certainty that even though the child who had cried in that room was long gone, the lessons they left behind would endure, quietly shaping the way we live, relate, and care. And I thought about how easy it is to overlook these moments in the rush of daily life, to ignore what is hidden, to miss the subtleties that hold meaning. And I resolved to continue noticing, listening, and honoring, to teach my family to do the same, so that no story, no memory, no emotion, however quiet or unseen, would ever be lost or forgotten. And I realize that this is the true magic of home and family, the awareness that love, care, and attention transform ordinary spaces and ordinary days into something extraordinary, into places where the past is respected, the present is cherished, and the future is shaped by empathy, understanding, and quiet, enduring connection. And as the sun would set each evening, casting warm light through the curtains and across the familiar walls, I felt a sense of completion and peace,
knowing that our home had become more than a collection of rooms. It had become a living story, a repository of lessons, memories, and love, and that in this quiet, reflective way, our family would continue to grow, learn, and support one another more, carrying forward the subtle, powerful wisdom of the room, the cries, and the life it once held. A reminder that even the smallest, most hidden stories can shape generations, inspire hearts, and teach the quiet, essential truth of empathy, care, and connection. And in this understanding, I felt a lasting warmth, a gentle hope, and a profound sense of belonging, knowing that through attention, compassion, and the willingness to witness life fully, we create a home not just of walls and roofs, but of love, memory, and enduring family ties, where every story matters, every life is honored, and every quiet lesson has the power to change us in the deepest, most meaningful ways.